Team Building Hot Dog Eating Contest. Written by Author JoJo. The company I'm currently working with recently went through a rather large shakeup when we were bought out and pushed into merger. Things were pretty hectic for a while, with bigwigs coming and going every day. Policy changes would appear overnight, and benefits for the workers altered for better or worse. I was the manager of a pretty successful branch, and as such had to sit in on a lot of meetings about this and that. One thing that was brought up time and time again was the troubling status of crumbling morale that was plaguing offices. I had noticed everyone seemed less enthusiastic when coming into work, never knowing what change was going to affect the day-to-day operations. Part of the reason my particular branch did well was that I took the effort to get to know the people I hired. Showing them that I was invested in their interest and concerns meant they were able to trust me, and were comfortable bringing new ideas to me. But with the shakeup, there was a lot of mistransparency going on, and it shut me off from the workers. So I'm not taking blame for what happened, but I am taking responsibility for the situation ever being possible in the first place. I thought that the people working under the managers might come to see us as the big bad monsters of the workforce. They would stop seeing us as people and start thinking of us as robots and there to crack the whip. During the meeting, I came up with the idea to take a day and invite everyone company-wide to a team-building exercise. This couldn't be something like a simple hiking trip or something other companies do to treat their employees. We needed to do something that would remind our workers that we were fallible, just humans that can be silly and look foolish sometimes. We all sat in the meeting trying to devise a fun way to pretty much humiliate the higher-ups in hopes to make the others more comfortable. I felt my stomach lurch as my lunch fought back, and a warm waft of muted flavors swirled in my mouth. Sitting there for a moment, I waited for the acidic taste of acid reflux to subside before talking. What about an eating contest? The rest of the leaders turned their heads to my direction. Like hot dogs or something, I continued, still faintly tasting the hot dogs I had for lunch earlier. I thought that watching your bosses stuff their faces with food was an interesting way to bring you down to their level. I knew that my team would love it at the very least. There were a few chuckles that rested on the border of dismissing the idea entirely. But after a while, we started working out the finer details, looking into how contests like that are typically run and deciding who would participate. It was decided that the managers from the top 5 branches would be a part of the eating contest. I'm sure you can guess which lucky son of a gun was going to be sitting there with a plate of hot dogs in front of them. My team was the 3rd highest sellers, so I would be seated right in the middle of the table. We rented out space at a local park and invited all the branches to come and watch their leaders stuff their faces. It wasn't mandatory, but come the day of, there was quite the turnout. I expected as much. People would pay to get to see their bosses humiliate themselves. Pulling a few park tables together and dropping a long nylon cloth over them, we started preparations. I am admittedly a fairly competitive person, and if I was going to be in any contest, I was going to try and win. So to put some skin on the table, I suggested there be a prize. If there was a prize that benefited the branch that won, the workers could get involved, cheering on their respective boss. And so it was decided. The company would pay out a cash prize for the manager to use for office parties of their choice. Then it was game on. All the hot dogs were cooked and our butts were in their seats. I looked to my right and noticed that Don Mellows was sitting next to me. I didn't even think that his branch was doing that well, but somehow they were outselling mine. Now, I'm no twig myself, but Don was a pretty big guy, and I suddenly felt like I was punching above my weight. Still, I was ready to win. With the call to start going out, I picked up my first hot dog and tried to quickly scarf it down. I remembered the higher-ups making sure to drill it in our heads not to push ourselves too hard. This was supposed to be a fun day out. When I saw that Don had already polished off 2 hot dogs in what seemed like no time, though, my competitive nature kicked in. I tried to go beat for beat with Don, who was clearly in the lead, but the man was putting them back like they were just disappearing in his stomach. Furthermore, I could tell he would every so often look over at me and stare at my face. My stomach was already filling up after 1 plate, so I started to slow down. But Don just trucked on. Was it the ketchup helping him, I wondered? Watching small globs of red running down his chin and covering his fingers, his eyes were a flurry, looking all over the place like a cat trying to hunt down a fly. Don, slow down, man, I spoke to him. I was getting concerned at the rate he was eating the food in front of him. All of us just barely polished off our first plate, and Don was nearing the end of his second. Instead of taking a second to respond, his eyes once again rolled around until their focus fell on me. And that's when I saw his eyes were watering. I was mesmerized by the way he just picked up bits of food over and over, stuffing them through his lips, barely giving himself any time to chew. I wasn't even eating anymore, just watching Don and listening to the crowd cheering him on. I could feel myself growing sick. It then clicked that the rate he was eating, he never had time to put more ketchup on the hot dogs. Yet the red viscous film grew thicker and more spilled out. Don, stop, I said gently as he continued onto his 3rd plate. Don, stop for a fucking second, I demanded. I couldn't take my eyes off his fingers as they stuffed food into his mouth. His 3rd plate gone, empty of food, but instead of stopping, he reached over with a shaking arm and grabbed more food from my plate. The crowd's cheering was starting to die down. A few excited calls were being consumed by silence. Having enough of this grotesque display, I reached my arm out, attempting to stop him. Saliva had infested the skin of his arms, making a firm grip difficult to gain, and he just slipped away, eating more and more. The gaze he gave me was fiery and full of desperation, and a thought came to my head. Don, blink if you can't stop, I said, watching his eyes intently, and then they shut for a moment. The red on him wasn't ketchup. I could see the flesh ragged and torn on his fingers. He was eating so fast that his teeth were closing before his fingers could retreat, grazing more and more skin off each time. Others must have heard what I said, and the person to his right pulled his plate of food out of Don's reach. I followed suit, watching his trembling fingers grasping at where the hot dogs used to be. Finally, without more food to eat, Don's puffed cheeks started to diminish as he was able to swallow the food that had been sitting in there. I let out a sigh and looked out to the crowd of people. Some of them were becoming visibly ill, and others had looks of concerns painted. But it was over at least. Whatever weird, compulsive actions had sent Don spiraling were gone now. I thought until I saw the crowd's jaws collectively dropping, letting out a sea of gasps. Under that gasp, I heard a sharp snap to my right. I knew before I even turned to look at Don, but I couldn't help myself. Shifting my gaze, I saw Don's teeth clenching down on his pointer and middle finger. He had already made it through the bone and was moving his jaw left and right, cutting the flesh. Before my brain could convince me to stop the large man, he pulled his hand away from his mouth, separating thin strands of skin on his fingers that still tried clinging together. Bile rose in my stomach, and I twisted away from Don and let the food I had just eaten evacuate my body. I stared at barely digested chunks of hot dogs in disgust as I tried to catch my breath. There was a commotion behind me, a struggle, the cause of which became incredibly clear when I saw a hand missing 2 fingers, grasping at my pile of regurgitated food. Reacting faster this time, I reached down to grab his arm as other managers ran to assist me. The way Don resisted our confinement was almost inhuman. Sure, he was a big guy, but there were 5 of us trying to pull him back from the table, and still he was making progress. It was like his life depended on eating more. He would have made it to the sludge I created if a few people in the crowd didn't leap into action and help us. It took a good while to pull him to the ground, and even longer for the paramedics to show up. By the time they did, we'd managed to get Don to drink some water to flush out his mouth and try to clean off the blood. There were no signs of his severed fingers. He must have swallowed them the moment he got the opportunity. He was a wreck. The skin on his still attached fingers was ragged. It looked like someone had doused them in acid. His mouth wasn't much prettier. I didn't see the inside until one of the paramedics shined a light in and I snuck a glimpse. He had mangled his tongue and the skin on his cheeks had been stripped so thin that a stiff breeze could punch a hole in them. His eyes looked vacant, like he let his mind slip away so that he didn't have to be present for what his body was doing. Still, though, tears ran down the side of his head. After that, he was taken away, and we were left to clean up. Told the workers to go home and that the managers would handle it. We kept an ear out for updates about Don while gossiping to each other about what happened. Theories ranging from a mental break to some outside force conducting Don. We raised questions that we never got the answers to. Don recovered and even returned to work sometime later, but whenever anyone would bring it up, he would laugh it off. Say he doesn't know what you're talking about. People assumed he really did have a mental breakdown and doesn't remember any of it. But I know differently. I asked him a question back then, and he responded to it. He wasn't able to stop. And now whenever I see him and look into his eyes, I see a hint of that desperation sitting right behind a cheery exterior. At least he's getting a pizza party out of it. He did win after all.